Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 4 of Series 8. The question for today is, what are the main theories of mind or consciousness, and are any of them viable? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 6, Section 3. So we have recently outlined Cartesian dualism, moderate dualism, and a physicalist account of mind. And we examined Daniel Dennett's critique of Cartesian dualism and his presentation of physicalism. But one argument against physicalism is the availability of alternative theories. Today, I want to run through as many of these alternative theories as I can. I won't go over dualism and physicalism again, but I want to discuss pluralism, externalism, panpsychism, panprotopsychism, structuralism, and ultraphenomenological accounts. Well, that's quite a lot. We will still have to omit some views like Spinoza's dual aspect theory of mind, as well as Berkeley's idealism of the world as the mind of God. And of course, the religious ideas of soul and spirit are also conceptions of mind. Yet I first want to briefly review a moderate dualist or anti-physicalist view. That is, it's possible to regard mind as a different kind of thing to matter without being a dualist. We can distinguish anti-physicalism and different kinds of dualism by looking at two features. One, their particular conceptions of mind, and two, the character of their relations with the world. Descartes, for example, defined mind as thinking substance with inexplicable relations with the world, and he characterized mind by rationality, transparency, indivisibility, and non-extension in space. But an externalist theory of mind allows immediate and inescapable relations with the world, and the mind can be characterized with structures quite different to those of Descartes. Now, pluralism is the view there aren't just one or two species of being, as in physicalism or dualism, but many. Karl Popper maintains three species of existence: matter, mind, and its abstract products. Different versions are held by Roger Penrose, Hubert Dreyfus, and Merleau-Ponty. Thomas Scannellin speaks of three domains: one, the natural; two, the mathematical; and three, the normative, moral, and reasons. In support of pluralism, we can also refer to the ontological status of mathematics and logic. Mathematical structures are not physical in any way. They are abstract through and through. Mathematical or logical ideas exist independently, such as in a book, and are not states of mind. The argument can be posed very simply in the following way. 1. Mathematics exist. It is neither physical nor mental. And 3. Therefore it is a third species of existence. Ironically, Daniel Dennett agrees that information is neither matter nor energy. So this might make him a pluralist rather than a physicalist. Yet pluralism challenges both the supposed unity of science as well as the categorizations of both dualism and monism. This is because the existence of abstraction challenges the idea of science as one monistic category. That is, abstractions are indisputably non-physical and are subject to a priori and necessary relations. Materiality is indisputably physical and is subject to a posteriori and contingent relations. Therefore, unity of either method or ontology doesn't exist in science. So this idea cannot be validly used as an argument. We can also note several consequences or benefits of pluralism. One, it provides an alternative to or moderates both physicalism and dualism. Two, properties of abstraction argue against both physical monism and a unity of science. And three, abstraction and physicality ontologically flank mind, rendering it more comprehensible. But in themselves, these arguments don't demonstrate the validity of pluralism. And taken to extremes, pluralism can take the form of Leibniz's metaphysics of simple substances or monads. But G.E. Moore called Leibniz's monads of multiplicity of categories an ontological slum. And we could similarly describe Plato's realm of ideal types as a potential infinite diversity. Now, panpsychism goes further than pluralism to claim that consciousness is everywhere and in everything. Panpsychism is favoured by David Chalmers, Colin Blakemore, Galen Strawson, Whitehead and others. John Searle calls some outcomes of pluralism as absurd. I agree, and it is seriously flawed. I think he's thinking about David Chalmers' reference to the possibility of conscious thermostats. And I regard panpsychism as another indication of the confusion surrounding consciousness. Strawson argues for panpsychism in the following way. 1. Mind exists, and most of us can agree with the premise. 2. Then Strawson asserts that mind can't be produced from non-mind. But this is a very contentious view, opposed by the widely held belief that mind is produced by the complexities of life, brain structures, and relations with the world. And there are no good reasons to suppose that mind can't be produced from non-mind. To illustrate the tenuousness of the idea that mind can't be produced from non-mind, we might also mistakenly reason that biological life can't be produced from inanimate chemicals. And 3, but Strawson concludes that therefore mind must be everywhere, manifestly expressed in human beings. But his second premise above is in doubt, and the plausibility of his conclusion is also challenged. This is because of a stronger counter-argument that consciousness has properties that don't exist in the physical world. Mind or consciousness has properties like cognition and sentience, as well as others like intentionality. These properties do not exist in everything and aren't everywhere in the world. Therefore, consciousness, as it must be defined, does not exist everywhere and in everything. Yet there is a stronger form of panpsychism in Hindu and Buddhist thought that consciousness precedes matter. Even Max Planck said, "I regard matter as derivative from consciousness." Ian McGilchrist holds that matter is a phase of consciousness, and Donald Hoffman believes that consciousness creates all objects and properties of the physical world. But in addition to the earlier difficulties, these views face further overwhelming problems. That is, how can a ubiquitous consciousness be the same consciousness of which we have personal experience? And what created consciousness? And how can consciousness produce matter? These are seemingly irresolvable problems, and they only seem resolvable by appealing to a larger problem of a creator God. Now, externalism isn't the view that consciousness is everywhere and in the world, but it's the view that consciousness is produced by interactions with the external world. That is, externalism typically argues that there has been an overemphasis of brain neurology in explaining mind. Ted Honderich described this as the impulse to etherealize or cranialize consciousness. Other externalists have described this tendency in similar terms. For example, Sean Gallagher's neurocentrism and Ron Harris' neurological fallacy. And Raymond Tallis described this overemphasis of the brain as neuromania. Externalism regards relations, events, and experiences in the world as complex and as necessary as brain events. One argument for this is that brains without worlds can't produce minds, that is, like a brain in a vat. In an argument against the brain in a vat view, Hilary Putnam refers to Aristotle as an externalist. But here we are talking about epistemological externalism, which Putnam contrasts to Plato's views. On Plato's view, knowledge resides within us and doesn't have to be derived from the external world. Following this thinking, Alverno holds that we have made a category error in understanding mind. That is, understanding mind in terms of brain is like understanding the monetary value in terms of metallurgy. No presents mind as a relation, process, or interaction between the center and external objects. Numerous thinkers, such as Thomas Metzinger, are also developing such a relational and process view of consciousness. For example, Riccardo Manzotti sees externalism going beyond the brain in a process that relates to the world. Even theologian Don Cupid sees consciousness as relational and as a temporal process. But externalism implies relations and processes that depend on unexplained structures of consciousness. Yet the concepts of structure and phenomenology and the relation between them isn't always recognized, but it becomes apparent when pointed out in the work of Husserl, Heidegger and Sartre. Intentionality is a structure that explains the relation between internal mental states and external cognitive objects. Intentionality thereby describes the relation between mind and object in externalism. In another context, intentionality explains the significance of objects as a supporting framework, and both intent and mental object are important to the quality of mind produced. Intentionality implies a structural relation between its internal constitution and its external mental objects. Georges Bataille compared mind to water in a bottle. I extend the metaphor to that of liquid in a vessel. Here, the walls of the vessel are the cognitive frameworks which support and shape the mental liquid. The greater the quality, self-sufficiency and independence of that mental liquid, the less it will require the support of external cognitive frameworks. Structure here also reveals a value imperative that we will discuss shortly. The diversity of the external world as one of the preconditions of consciousness is further illustrated by Sartre. Sartre does this by making an identification between consciousness and choice as selection. He writes that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing, which is going a bit far, but nevertheless it makes the point, and choice is a relation and a way of relating to the world. But he also writes, choice isn't just a preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. But Sartre doesn't actually provide an analysis tracing choice back to its ontological foundation. But we can fill in by saying that contrast is a form of selection essential to cognition and thereby to consciousness. And we can continue to say that choice expresses contrast and selection. For example, when I look left or right, I affirm what is on my right and negate what is on my left. These are the kind of selections that are essential to epistemic contrasts and perceptions. For example, a white spot on a white board can't be seen. It needs a contrast. The contrasts and selections of an external world are thereby essential to consciousness, and that such contrasts and selections constitute the relational aspect of consciousness. Consciousness can be seen as a process in at least three ways. One, A.N. Whitehead's concept of prehension of how consciousness relates to objects as a process. That is, consciousness relates to objects in the same way that objects relate to each other. In this way, Whitehead can be said to integrate the two concepts of relation and process. Secondly, we can also see consciousness as a graduated process of development in species as well as in individuals. And three, we find process in Heidegger's view of temporality and time as the horizon of being. Heidegger's Dasein as a being in the world, or essentially in relation to the world, Husserl called the life world. This view is renowned for its dissolution of Descartes' subject-object and mind-world dichotomy. Yet Heidegger also emphasized that Dasein was in the world of temporality and time. Husserl had similarly spoken of the flow of consciousness and the flow of becoming, in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. There is here the notion of time as an essential feature of consciousness as an ongoing process. We not only find ourselves in a world of time or temporality, but time is a constituent of consciousness. We find ourselves in a world of time as well as diversity, divisibility, selection and choice. Consciousness is moving through time as well as through diversity in space, and that movement is a developmental process. Relations and processes also help me to explain the origins of consciousness as aspects of panprotopsychism. Panprotopsychism is an alternative to panpsychism, which retains the idea of natural and universal emergence. On panprotopsychism, mind isn't everywhere, but there's an ubiquitous property that produces mind. The big question here is, what is that ubiquitous property? I hope to answer this question with an interactionist account of mind in 2 weeks' time. I advance an interactionist account of mind and a structural view of consciousness as a process and relation. And the interactions are the complex interactions within matter and between events that produce mind. Conscious interaction with the external world isn't the same kind of interaction that produces mind at its inception. That is, cognitive interaction with the world isn't the same as the physical interaction that initially produces mind. Yet the principle of interaction is common to both physical causal interactions and mental interactions. It's in this way that I want to link and explain the relation of mind to the physical. This was described by David Chalmers as the hard problem of consciousness. That is, even after all preconditions have been explained, why should consciousness still emerge? At one level, the problem is impossible to resolve due to Hume's critique of causality as constant conjunctions. Yet we can and will always be able to reduce that gap between explanation and phenomenon. This is the task posed by panprotopsychism of discovering a ubiquitous property that produces mind. As I said, I will discuss panprotopsychism as an explanation of the preconditions of consciousness in 2 weeks. Yet there are other factors that are needed to explain consciousness to be discussed in future workshops. But even if we explain such a ubiquitous property that produces mind, that doesn't mean that we understand mind. To understand mind or consciousness, we need to be able to view it from a multiplicity of perspectives. And some of those perspectives are those of process, relation and structure. As indicated above, structures have a large part to play in a phenomenological account of consciousness. Standard structures in this view are the ones of intentionality, temporality and graduation. Yet we've also previously noted other structures like insularity, ephemerality and insubstantiality. Insubstantiality can also describe Sartre's account of consciousness as being for itself. That is, being for itself lacks the solidity and permanence of material being in itself. Sartre also unrestrainedly names a multiplicity of features as structures. These include freedom, choice, presence, facticity, value, possibility, negation and finitude. But I think these are features or properties rather than structures because they aren't internally inherent or give shape or form to consciousness. But the idea of structures of consciousness isn't always accepted and is often rejected. Colin McGinn, for instance, claims that consciousness is too thin and insubstantial to have structures. And postmodernists reject both universal structures and structures of consciousness. They claim that structures cannot underlie the whole of human life, but they are directing their attention to social and psychological structures such as of Marx and Freud. Yet phenomenologists are instead talking about structures of consciousness, not of psychology or society. And postmodernism has physicalist inclinations which rule out consciousness and thereby also rule out structures. And as an argument against physicalism, the above argument for structures can be reversed. 1. We observe properties of consciousness that can be described as structures. 2. There is an underlying phenomenon producing them that we call consciousness. 3. These are the properties of consciousness that cannot be attributed to the physical world. And 4. Therefore, on Leibniz's theory of indiscernibles, consciousness cannot be an aspect of the physical world. And a basic argument for structure can be made as follows. 1. Consciousness exists. 2. Therefore it has properties. 3. Those properties are best described as structures. Yet in my view, the main argument in favour of a structural account is its power of explanation. This has already begun above and will continue in future workshops. And structure explains consciousness that is often described as inexplicable. But a structural account of consciousness depends upon a phenomenological appreciation of consciousness. Different versions of this view are offered by Barry Dainton and Sartre. Dainton emphasizes this view by making a distinction between the phenomenal self and the psychological self. He explains the idea of a phenomenal self with the fictional idea of teleportation. That is, people are reconstituted as data and reconstructed exactly as before, down to every last neuron and memory. They believe themselves to be the same person as before, that is, their psychological self. They think they are the same person because they have the memories of the previous person. But Dainton and others suspect that teleportation would be a form of suicide. This is because the phenomenal self would not have the same phenomenal identity as the previous person. This idea is startling to some people. This is because they identify themselves with their memories and other aspects of their psychological selves. But it also reveals a widespread lack of awareness of this phenomenological perspective. Another version of this phenomenological view of consciousness is offered by Sartre. But Sartre's version is even more radical and is sometimes described as ultraphenomenological. That is, consciousness is seen as an all or nothing entity untrammeled by psychological constraints. This ultra-phenomenological view had the advantage of illustrating a particular aspect of consciousness. For example, phenomenology criticizes science for omitting the conscious observer from its perspective, and phenomenology properly isolates nature and psychology from morals and value imperatives. This is in addition to bring attention to the phenomenal self. But if applied indiscriminately, phenomenology also neglects important aspects of consciousness, such as graduations of free will, choice, the unconscious, and in tracing the origins of mind. Sartre, for example, tells us that we are condemned to be free, and by implication we are condemned to choose, and that even that choosing not to choose is a kind of choice. This may be the case for an ideally fully conscious state, but I have doubts about this in cases of indifference or sheer lack of awareness. Sartre's ultraphenomenalism is also results in a binary view of free will, that we are either free or we are not. This again isn't realistic because free will, if we can use the term, is graduated into different degrees. Such a lack of graduation also leads to Sartre's depreciation of the unconscious and other states of awareness. This is because Sartre takes reflective consciousness to be a necessary condition of consciousness. That is, not to be conscious of what we are conscious of is contradictory and absurd. But again, this takes an ultra-phenomenological and binary view which excludes partial or degrees of consciousness. I find this unrealistic in light of empirical accounts of consciousness, the unconscious and the preconscious. But Sartre's ultraphenomenologism is still useful in highlighting a certain aspect of consciousness. In conclusion, we can repeat that to understand consciousness, or anything at all, we need a multiplicity of perspectives. We also need a multiplicity of theories to illuminate different aspects of consciousness. Some of the different theories we have outlined in the past 2 weeks are Cartesian dualism, moderate dualism, physicalism, eliminative materialism, disappearance theory, pluralism, externalism, panpsychism, panprotopsychism, structuralism, and ultraphenomenological accounts. Phenomenology typically employs structures like intentionality, temporality, and graduation. Yet we've also noted other structures like insularity, ephemerality, and insubstantiality. So the question, what is consciousness, can't be answered in a single sentence. It's more difficult to simplify than even the difficult question, what is matter? And the complexity of possible answers also reveals a lack of understanding of consciousness. But a number of both features as well as misleading ideas have been outlined. Firstly, consciousness isn't a kind of substance. Descartes took this notion from Renaissance science. Similarly, in my view, physicalism falsely sees consciousness as just a refinement of the physical world, and insisting that consciousness is an aspect of the physical world ensures that it won't be understood. The physical world is understood through empirical a posteriori observation. Mathematics is understood through necessary a priori relations. Consciousness must also be understood according to its own characteristics. Consciousness has a different mode of existence and must be understood in a different kind of way. That is through a first-person perspective and phenomenological observation as well as reason. I myself argue for an interactive and structural view of consciousness as a relation and process. Next week we'll talk about how phenomenology is different to psychology. So let me have your criticisms or comments at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.